Welcome back to the Daily Crypto Deep Dive. We're continuing this holiday deep dive today, and if you listen to part 1, you'll already understand why this matters. Because once you understand why money exists at all, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when money stops being something physical and starts becoming something abstract? A record, a promise, a number written down instead of a thing you can hold. This is the moment where money begins to change character, and it's the moment where power quietly enters the system. In early societies, money worked because it was anchored to physical reality. Whether it was grain, livestock, shells, silver, or gold, value existed independently of authority. You couldn't simply wish more gold into existence. You had to mine it. You had to work for it. You had to trade for it. That physical constraint mattered, because it limited abuse and imposed discipline on the system. Scarcity was enforced by nature itself. But as societies grew more complex, trade expanded, populations increased, and economies became harder to manage informally. Memory no longer scaled. Reputation became diluted. This is where record-keeping begins to reshape money itself. The earliest written economic records come from Mesopotamia, around 3300 BCE. Clay tablets discovered at sites like Uruk show detailed records of rations, labor obligations, temple offerings, and debts. These tablets were not symbolic curiosities. They were functional economic tools. What's important is that many of these transactions were recorded in units of silver by weight, even when no silver physically changed hands. Silver had already become a unit of account, a reference point, long before it was always used as a medium of exchange. Money was becoming conceptual. It was no longer just something you held. It was something you recorded, tracked, and deferred. Temples and palaces acted as the central institutions of early economies. They stored grain, redistributed food, organized labor, enforced obligations, and kept records. This structure made sense in a world where religion, governance, and economics were inseparable. But it also created a fundamental shift. Value was no longer held only by individuals. It was pooled, stored, and managed by institutions. And institutions kept ledgers that outlived the people who created them. Economic memory was becoming institutional rather than personal. And whilst we touched on this in part 1, we need to revisit this for what's coming next. Once value is recorded, it can be delayed. Once it's delayed, it can be promised. And once it's promised, it can be leveraged, layered, and multiplied. This is where formal debt enters the system in a way that permanently alters how money behaves. Debt is older than coinage, and that often surprises people. Written records show that credit arrangements existed thousands of years before coins were widely used. Farmers borrowed seed grain against future harvests. Laborers received rations in advance. Merchants settled balances over time rather than immediately. These systems allowed economies to grow, smooth shocks, and coordinate labor. But they also introduced fragility. A debt-based system assumes the future will behave in broadly predictable ways. When it doesn't, when droughts arrive, wars break out, or trade routes collapse, debt stops being a lubricant and becomes a weapon. Ancient Mesopotamian rulers understood this risk intuitively. We have records of periodic debt jubilees, where obligations were wiped clean to prevent social collapse and mass enslavement. This tells us something important. Even early societies recognized that unchecked debt accumulation could tear a system apart from the inside. They didn't treat debt as moral failure. They treated it as a structural risk that required intervention, because social stability mattered more than perfect accounting. As money became increasingly abstract in daily economic life, gold and silver remained the ultimate stores of long-term value. But fewer people interacted with metal directly. Instead, they interacted with records, promises, tallies, and balances. This worked as long as trust held, not blind trust, but practical trust reinforced by social norms, religious authority, and the threat of enforcement. And trust, throughout history, has always been conditional. Coinage marked another turning point. When coins emerged in Lydia around the 7th century BCE, they standardized value and increased trade efficiency dramatically. But they also embedded political authority directly into money. A coin was not just metal, it was metal stamped with power. The stamp told you who guaranteed the weight and purity. Trust began to shift away from the metal itself and toward the issuer. This shift was subtle, but profound. As empires expanded, coinage became a tool of control. Taxes were levied in official currency. Armies were paid in it. Conquered regions were forced into monetary systems they did not design. Money became political, even while remaining physically real. And as long as coins contained genuine metal, there was still a constraint on manipulation. Debasement did occur, especially in times of war or fiscal stress, but it was visible. People could weigh coins. They could test purity. When debasement went too far, confidence collapsed. The Roman Empire provides one of the clearest examples of this slow erosion of trust over centuries. The deeper transformation, however, occurs when money begins to move without metal at all. By the medieval period, abstraction becomes more pronounced. And one of the clearest, most concrete examples of this shift comes from the Knights Templar. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't accidental. It was one of the first genuinely international banking systems in history, and it functioned almost entirely on trust. During the Crusades, thousands of pilgrims traveled from Europe to the Holy Land. Carrying large amounts of gold or silver on such journeys made them easy targets for bandits and thieves. The Knights Templar offered a solution. A pilgrim could deposit gold at a Templar house in places like Paris or London, receive a written credit note, travel across Europe and the Mediterranean, and then redeem that value at a Templar preceptory in Jerusalem or Acre. No gold crossed borders, only trust did. This system worked because the Templars were perceived as disciplined, incorruptible, and powerful. Their religious vows reinforced this perception. Their military strength enforced it. They had effectively created an early international clearing system. Deposits in one region could be withdrawn in another. Balances were tracked across vast distances. Obligations were honored without the movement of physical metal. Money had become information. What matters here is not just that the system worked, but why it worked. Pilgrims did not need to understand how the Templars managed their books. They did not audit vaults or inspect ledgers. They only needed to believe that the receipt they carried would be honored. And for decades, it was. Trust replaced metal, and efficiency increased dramatically. Over time, the Templars extended this system beyond pilgrims. They lent money to kings. They safeguarded royal treasuries. They financed wars. They acted as financial intermediaries between states and regions. By the early 13th century, they were effectively acting as bankers to Europe's ruling class. And this is where the deeper lesson appears. Those who control money flows become strategically important, even if they do not formally rule. The Knights Templar did not collapse because their banking system failed. They collapsed because they became too powerful. King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the order, moved against them. Charges were brought, arrests followed, assets were seized. The organization was dismantled, not because its model was flawed, but because it worked too well in a world where political power was still enforced through violence rather than law. This episode matters because it shows, very clearly, that once money becomes abstract, whoever controls the records controls the system. Trust concentrates power, and concentrated power attracts challenge. Receipts are only valuable as long as the institution behind them survives. The same pattern repeats again and again. By the late medieval and early modern periods, goldsmith banks followed a similar model. People deposited gold for safekeeping and received receipts. Those receipts circulated as money. Goldsmiths noticed that only a fraction of depositors ever redeemed their gold at the same time. So they issued more receipts than gold held. Fractional reserve banking was born, not through conspiracy, but through observation and incentive. The system increased liquidity and economic growth. It allowed more trade, more investment, and more complexity. But it also increased fragility. Bank runs became an inevitable feature. Trust could evaporate faster than metal could be produced. At this point, money is no longer just a neutral tool for exchange or storage of value. It is a mechanism for transferring risk, concentrating power, and shaping societies. Most people still experience money as neutral. But structurally, it no longer is. And this is the pivot point of the entire story. Once money is no longer constrained by physical reality, it becomes constrained only by trust in institutions. From here onward, every major monetary crisis follows the same pattern: expansion, abstraction, overreach, collapse, reset. In the next episode, we bring this story into the modern world: fiat currency, central banks, inflation, asset bubbles, and why so many people feel like they are working harder, saving more, and yet falling further behind. Because once money becomes fully detached from reality, the effects don't show up immediately. They compound quietly, year after year. That's part 3. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, follow for the next part of this series. And as always, we will see you at the top.